MacDougal Street. Summer of 1974. If you walked this block back then, you probably remember it. And right there, between an Indian boutique and a gypsy palm reader, was our contribution to the madness. And that sign you're looking at? Well, that wasn't the official one. The professional sign for underground treasures was still being made. So, we improvised. We made a temporary DECO sign out of electrical tape. Because nothing says long-term business plan like adhesive. 5 or 6 steps down led into the store. 5 or 6 steps up led to the upstairs shops and apartments. And somewhere in between was 2 brothers hoping the tape held. In the summer of 1974, Don and Bill Soffer became business owners. Kind of. They had no plan, no merchandise, no experience, and no air conditioning. They had scraped together just enough cash for the first month's rent and a security deposit. Mostly in small bills, a handful of subway tokens, and one Kennedy $50 Don insisted had sentimental value. Just not that much. What they did have was a storefront on MacDougal Street, a lease, and a big dream, half written on a partially used napkin. The space itself had lived many lives. Once a candle shop, then a shoe store, and judging by the layout, probably a zoning violation, with good intentions. It sat sandwiched between 2 unforgettable neighbors. On the right, a gypsy parlor, where Madame Velka told fortunes, smoked unfiltered cigarettes, knocked on the window to beckon passers-by inside, and definitely knew too much about your aura. On the left, a soft-spoken artist from India. A man with a beard that looked like something you might rescue from a tree after a storm. He sold children's clothing from a narrow, incense-thick corridor that smelled like curry, hope, and fabric dye. Underground treasures sat right in the middle. And for a long time, it looked like that was exactly where failure liked to nap. The landlord handed them the key. A bent brass rusty old thing. The kind of key that feels like it comes with a tetanus warning. And with that, Don and Bill ran across MacDougal Street. Not like proud new business owners, but like they had just robbed the place instead of renting it. They threw open the door. Inside was one light bulb, swinging gently, like it had unresolved trauma. A cracked floor that gave pre-war charm a bad name, and looked like it lost the war. And a smell that was either mildew or very old pastrami. They stood there in silence. The dream was real. So was the smell. The entrance dropped 8 steps down, like the city itself was quietly warning them. Whatever happens next, you brought this on yourself. They'd call it underground treasures. Bill glanced around and fired back that Don seemed to be forgetting the part where there were no treasures. Don didn't miss a beat. That was the underground part. Bill looked at the floor and muttered that it wasn't underground. It was a floor with anxiety. Then came the million-dollar question. Don asked what they were going to sell. Bill reminded him they didn't even own a shelf to put nothing on. Don insisted this was how Edison started. Bill paused. Edison? Edison invented the light bulb. We can't even afford a lampshade. They had a key, a dream, and absolutely zero inventory. That afternoon, across the street, the bell rang at Loki's Wahoo Bazaar. A store that never seemed to sell anything specific, yet somehow always had smoke pouring out of it. Loki himself wandered over, a grizzled merchant with sandal feet and cigarette-stained fingers, holding a paper cup of something vaguely herbal. He welcomed them to the block and asked how things were going. Don thanked him and asked if he had any advice for new business owners. Loki smirked and asked if they knew how much money he'd made that day. Loki whispered, 75 cents. Then he offered to give them some advice. Bill stopped him right there. He said he couldn't take advice from a man who spent all day making 75 cents. Don, without missing a beat, asked if that was before or after taxes. Loki drifted back across the street, returning to incense, bootleg comic books, and an ever-changing inventory of things that probably shouldn't have been for sale. Bill sighed and said this was a mistake. Don shook his head. No. This was pre-success. Bill sniffed the air and said it smelled like despair. Don shrugged. That was just Loki. Next door. The artist. Soft-spoken. Entrepreneurial. A man whose beard made you wonder if it was hiding secrets. Or snacks. He wore a white robe that looked like it doubled as both spiritual attire and backup inventory. He sold children's clothing handmade in India, dyed in brilliant oranges and blues, folded neatly behind beaded curtains. It was art, not fashion. And sales were flatlining. Until one day, a tourist wandered in and asked about a cotton shirt. Without blinking, the artist smiled and explained that this was a lucky shirt. Wear it, and good things happen. Boom. Sold. From that moment on, everything had a new name. Lucky shirts, lucky pants, lucky wedding dresses, and double lucky children's robes for good exam results. Tourists loved it. Especially NYU parents trying to buy their kid a little downtown edge. And maybe a little luck. Before heading back to Scarsdale. What they didn't know was that everything shrank to toddler size in the first wash. When asked about it, the artist simply shrugged. Luck was not guaranteed in hot water. Watching Lucky Pants fly out the door. And Loki's comic incense empire refused to die. Don and Bill knew it was time to improvise. That night, Don pointed at his mother's dining room buffet table like it owed him money. Antiques, he said. They had antiques. They had junk that looked like history. That was value. Bill asked if he meant the tea set from Aunt Joe's garage. Exactly. They dusted it. They named it. Boom. The Depression-era teacup of solitude. $40. They raided their parents' storage space. Then broke into the abandoned coat room of a defunct Polish strip club Don once danced at. But that's another story. They added recycled jeans, X-rated t-shirts, weird jewelry, and a record player that only played side B. It was chaos. But it was inventory. The village finds the Soffer brothers. The NYU kids found underground treasures. And then, they never stopped coming. They bought jeans worn by the ghosts of drummers past. Lava lamps with suspect wiring. Rings of uncertain origin. And one stuffed badger dressed like Napoleon. Later banned from the store. The shop became a place you didn't mean to visit. But always left with something you didn't need, couldn't explain. And swore had a vibe. Even Loki started sending customers over. Ask for the haunted lamp, he'd say. And don't look it in the eyes. Next door. Lucky Pants were still selling. And tourists were still being reassured that their honeymoon would be blessed. But not to tumble dry. Epilogue. Where it all began. A parlor where Madame Velka knew your future. A boutique where pants came with destiny. And 2 zippers. And a shop called Underground Treasures. Where every object came with a story. And if it didn't, Don and Bill just made one up. Underground Treasures. Established 1974. Shrinking shirts not included. Don and Bill Soffer. Brothers. Storytellers. And proud survivors of the 75-cent economy. And that photograph. Taken in the summer of 1974? Well, that's my brother and me. And still hoping, the tape would hold.